What is about to be described represents the single most consequential military scenario in human history, involving more economic value, more sophisticated weapon systems, and more potential for cascading global catastrophe than any conflict since World War II. And yet Western publics remain almost completely unaware of how rapidly the conditions for this scenario are being assembled. In the past 18 months, developments have occurred across military procurement, diplomatic positioning, and economic preparation that suggest China is not merely contemplating a Taiwan blockade as theoretical contingency, but actively preparing for execution within a time frame that Western intelligence agencies are now privately assessing as alarmingly compressed. Documents that reached Washington in the past 90 days indicate that Chinese military planners have completed operational planning for what they term comprehensive maritime quarantine, with a level of technical sophistication that addresses every challenge Western analysts previously assumed would make such action prohibitively difficult. I am going to take you inside every dimension of this scenario. How would China actually execute a blockade that neutralizes American military response without triggering nuclear escalation? What happens to the global economy when 80% of the world's most advanced semiconductors suddenly become unavailable? And what does a world transformed by Chinese control of Taiwan mean for American power, allied confidence, and the entire structure of the international system that has existed since 1945? There are no comfortable answers in what follows, but history does not care about comfort, only about structural forces and strategic incentives. 4 questions will drive everything that follows, and by the end of this analysis, you will understand why a Taiwan blockade represents not a remote possibility, but an increasingly probable scenario, why American responses are far more limited than public rhetoric suggests, and why the consequences extend far beyond a regional military conflict into a fundamental transformation of global power dynamics. It is. Let me be absolutely precise about what a Chinese blockade of Taiwan would actually look like, because the Western media discussion of this scenario is almost deliberately vague, and that vagueness obscures the sophistication of Chinese planning and the severity of challenges facing any American response. A Chinese blockade would not be a 19th century naval cordon with warships stopping merchant vessels at gunpoint. It would be a multi-domain operation, integrating naval surface vessels, submarine forces, aerial denial, cyber warfare, economic coercion, and legal political positioning that collectively makes it impossible for Taiwan to maintain economic functionality, while providing China with plausible deniability about committing acts of war against third parties. The operation would begin with declaration of an air defense identification zone extending 200 kilometers from Taiwan's coast, backed by combat air patrols of J-20 stealth fighters and J-16 multi-role aircraft operating from bases in Fujian province, which is approximately 130 kilometers from Taiwan. Any aircraft entering this zone without Chinese authorization would be warned, tracked, and potentially intercepted. This establishes Chinese control of Taiwanese airspace without requiring actual attacks on Taiwanese territory. Simultaneously, China would declare expanded military exercise zones, covering the waters surrounding Taiwan, closing these zones to commercial navigation under the justification of safety during live fire exercises. International maritime law allows nations to declare such zones, providing legal cover for what is actually a blockade while avoiding the technical declaration of war that a formal blockade would represent. Chinese submarines, including the Type 093 attack submarines and newer Type 095 boats with significantly improved quieting technology, would establish patrol zones in the Philippine Sea to the east of Taiwan and in the Luzon Strait connecting the South China Sea to the Pacific. These submarines would track any American carrier strike groups approaching Taiwan while also monitoring merchant vessels attempting to reach Taiwanese ports. The submarine presence creates existential threat to American carriers without requiring any aggressive action, simply by being present and capable. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, which are larger and more heavily armed than military vessels of most nations, would enforce the quarantine zone against civilian shipping, boarding vessels allegedly to inspect for contraband or verify compliance with Chinese safety regulations. This allows China to stop ships bound for Taiwan while maintaining the fiction that this is law enforcement rather than military action. Let me give you the specific capabilities that make this blockade operationally feasible in ways it would not have been even 5 years ago. China now operates 3 aircraft carriers, with a 4th under construction, providing persistent carrier presence in the Western Pacific that did not exist during previous Taiwan crises. More importantly, China has constructed artificial islands in the South China Sea equipped with airfields, radar installations, and anti-ship missile batteries that extend Chinese military reach across the entire South China Sea and into the Philippine Sea. The H-20 stealth bomber, which China unveiled in prototype form 8 months ago, provides long-range strike capability that can hold American bases in Guam, Japan, and South Korea at risk without requiring Chinese aircraft to penetrate advanced air defense systems. Each H-20 can carry 15 tons of precision-guided munitions with combat radius exceeding 5,000 kilometers, meaning Chinese bombers can strike American installations while operating from bases in central China beyond the range of American tactical aircraft. The DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile, which China has deployed in quantities estimated at over 300 launchers, can strike moving naval targets at ranges up to 4,000 kilometers, with circular error probable of approximately 30 meters. This weapon system specifically targets aircraft carriers, and its existence fundamentally changes the calculation for American carrier operations near Taiwan. A single DF-26 missile costs approximately $5 million. An American aircraft carrier represents 70 years of accumulated investment totaling approximately $25 billion, including air wing and escort vessels. China can hold every American carrier at risk for 1/5 of 1% of what that carrier costs. But the military capabilities, while essential, are actually only the first layer of how this blockade would work. Let me explain the economic and political dimensions, because they are what make the blockade truly effective. Anh tôi anh tin case away. Here is what happens to Taiwan's economy within 72 hours of a comprehensive Chinese blockade, and why those economic effects create political pressure that is far more dangerous to Taiwan than any military action. Taiwan is an island with almost no natural resources and limited agricultural capacity. Taiwan imports 98% of its energy, including all crude oil and natural gas. Taiwan imports 67% of its food. Taiwan's economy depends entirely on exports, with export value equivalent to 62% of GDP, and semiconductors representing 35% of total export value. A blockade that prevents ships from reaching Taiwanese ports means Taiwan's energy supplies are exhausted within 30 to 40 days, assuming full rationing. Taiwan's Strategic Petroleum Reserve contains approximately 146 days of crude oil at normal consumption, but refining that crude into usable fuel requires natural gas, of which Taiwan has only approximately 3 weeks' supply. Food supplies become critical within 60 to 90 days. Taiwan maintains emergency food reserves, but these are calculated for natural disasters, not sustained blockades. Rationing can extend supplies, but rationing also means immediate reduction in caloric intake and complete elimination of dietary variety. A population of 23.5 million people cannot be sustained indefinitely on emergency rice reserves. But here's what makes the economic pressure truly devastating. Taiwan's semiconductor fabrication facilities, which produce chips worth approximately $150 billion annually, require continuous operation to maintain functionality. These facilities cannot be shut down and restarted like conventional factories. A modern semiconductor fab operates 24 hours per day, 365 days per year, with downtime measured in minutes per year. The fabrication process requires ultra-pure water, specialty chemicals, industrial gases, and most critically, continuous electrical power with voltage stability that exceeds normal commercial standards. Any interruption to power supply or chemical inputs means the entire production batch is destroyed, equipment is damaged, and facilities require weeks or months of recommissioning before normal production resumes. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company operates 12 major fabrication facilities, with the most advanced fabs representing investments of $20 billion each. These facilities consume approximately 5% of Taiwan's total electrical generation. If Taiwan's energy supplies are disrupted by blockade, either these fabs shut down, destroying months of production and potentially damaging equipment worth tens of billions of dollars, or Taiwan diverts energy from civilian consumption to maintain fab operations, meaning immediate blackouts, transportation disruption, and social breakdown. China understands this calculation perfectly. A blockade does not need to last until Taiwan's military collapses from lack of ammunition. It only needs to last until Taiwan's civilian population faces energy shortages, food rationing, and economic catastrophe severe enough that continued resistance becomes politically impossible. Let me give you the timeline that Chinese planners are working with. Days 1 through 7, initial economic shock as energy prices spike, food hoarding begins, and financial markets collapse. Taiwanese stock market loses 30 to 50% of value. New Taiwan dollar depreciates 20 to 30% against major currencies as capital flight accelerates. Global semiconductor customers begin emergency negotiations with Chinese intermediaries for continued supply. Days 8 through 21. Energy rationing begins as refined fuel supplies decline. Transportation disruptions cascade through economy. Food prices increase 50 to 100% as import disruption and hoarding combine. Civil unrest begins in major cities as populations realize blockade will not be quickly resolved. Taiwanese government faces impossible choice between maintaining semiconductor production or ensuring civilian energy access. Days 22 through 45. Energy crisis becomes acute as strategic petroleum reserve reaches critical levels. Either semiconductor fabs shut down, destroying Taiwan's economic value and leverage, or civilian energy access is severely curtailed, creating humanitarian crisis and political collapse. International pressure for negotiated settlement becomes overwhelming as global semiconductor shortage begins affecting everything from automobiles to smartphones to military systems. Days 46 through 60. If blockade continues beyond this point, Taiwan has effectively lost regardless of military situation. Energy supplies are exhausted. Food is critically scarce. Semiconductor production is destroyed, and population is desperate for resolution regardless of terms. Chinese negotiating position is absolute because Taiwan has no remaining leverage. This timeline explains why Chinese military planners believe they can achieve their objectives without firing a shot. But the blockade itself, if maintained against American attempts to break it, accomplishes everything China needs. Taiwan is economically destroyed, politically broken, and desperate for any settlement that restores energy and food access. Now here is the truly uncomfortable question that Western strategists are grappling with. What's been what can the United States actually do to break a Chinese blockade of Taiwan? And what costs would America face in attempting to do so? The answer requires brutal honesty about American military capabilities, political constraints, and strategic priorities. The United States maintains overwhelming military power in absolute terms, but overwhelming power does not translate into usable options when the adversary controls geography, can escalate at will, and possesses the ability to impose catastrophic costs on American forces. Let me walk through the American response options systematically, because each option carries consequences that are far more severe than public discussion acknowledges. Option 1. Amis base ho says. Naval convoy operations. In this scenario, the United States declares that it will escort merchant vessels to Taiwan using U.S. Navy warships, daring China to attack American vessels and trigger a war that China allegedly wants to avoid. This option sounds decisive and has historical precedent in operations ranging from World War I convoy operations to tanker war escort missions in the Persian Gulf during the 1980s. The challenge is that Taiwan is 7,000 miles from the American West Coast, 100 miles from mainland China. Any American convoy approaching Taiwan must operate under continuous observation from Chinese surveillance systems, within range of Chinese land-based aircraft, and in waters where Chinese submarines have overwhelming local advantage. China does not need to attack American warships directly. China simply maintains its declared military exercise zones, enforces them against civilian shipping using Coast Guard vessels, and makes clear that any American military vessels entering these zones will be interpreted as hostile action justifying defensive response. This places the United States in the position of having to fire first, crossing from escort operations to offensive action that breaks the blockade through military force. If American forces fire on Chinese Coast Guard vessels, China immediately characterizes this as unprovoked American aggression against Chinese law enforcement, escalates to military response using naval and air forces, and global opinion fractures over whether America or China bears responsibility for the conflict. If American forces do not fire and instead attempt to physically push through Chinese vessels, the convoys are stopped anyway. American warships look impotent, and the blockade continues while America has expended enormous diplomatic capital on a response that failed. The operational challenges are even more severe. The U.S. Navy would need to assemble and sustain convoy operations across 7,000 miles of ocean while defending against submarine threats, aerial attacks, and missile strikes from Chinese forces operating from home territory with unlimited sustainment. The fuel, ammunition, and logistics required to maintain continuous convoy operations would strain American naval capacity while exposing expensive American warships to constant threat. Most critically, China can escalate at any point by attacking American bases in Japan, South Korea, or Guam, forcing the United States to either retaliate against Chinese territory or accept attacks on American forces. Either path leads to major power war that America cannot win without costs that far exceed any conceivable benefit from preserving Taiwanese independence. I assess the probability of sustained American convoy operations at less than 15% because the operational challenges and escalation risks are prohibitive. But option 2, a distant blockade of Chinese energy imports. In this scenario, the United States does not attempt to break the Taiwan blockade directly, but instead imposes its own blockade of Chinese energy imports, particularly oil shipments from the Middle East that transit through the Strait of Malacca. This approach uses America's advantages in geography and naval reach to impose symmetric costs on China without requiring operations in waters where China holds advantages. The challenge is that a blockade of Chinese energy imports is an act of war that affects far more than China. Approximately 1/4 of global oil trade passes through the Strait of Malacca, bound not only for China, but also for Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asian nations. An American blockade of the strait would devastate allied economies, potentially more severely than it affects China. China has spent 20 years preparing for exactly this scenario by building strategic petroleum reserves, estimated at over 1 billion barrels, developing overland energy import routes, including pipelines from Russia and Central Asia, and creating economic relationships that allow China to source energy from suppliers who will not comply with American blockade efforts. An American blockade lasting 3 to 6 months would certainly impose severe costs on China, but it would simultaneously destroy Asian economic integration, turn American allies into opponents, create oil price spikes that devastate the American economy, and still not resolve the Taiwan situation, because China can endure economic pain far longer than Taiwan can survive without energy and food. I assess the probability of an American distant blockade at less than 10%, because the costs to American allies and the global economy exceed the cost to China in the time frame relevant to Taiwan's survival. Option 3, direct military action against Chinese forces. In this scenario, the United States decides that the only way to break the blockade is through direct military strikes against Chinese naval vessels, aircraft, and potentially bases on mainland China. This option reflects conventional military planning, where superior American capabilities should enable destruction of Chinese blockading forces, opening sea lanes for supply to Taiwan. The challenge is that direct military action against Chinese forces almost certainly triggers Chinese retaliation against American bases, aircraft, and vessels using capabilities that China has developed specifically for this scenario. China does not need to defeat the American military. China only needs to impose costs severe enough that America decides continued conflict is not worth the price. Let me give you the specific cost exchange calculations that make this scenario almost unthinkable. The United States currently operates 11 aircraft carriers, with typically 3 to 4 available for deployment at any given time due to maintenance cycles. Each carrier strike group represents approximately $25 billion in accumulated investment and embarks approximately 6,000 personnel, including carrier crew and air wing. China's DF-21 and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, combined with YJ-18 subsonic cruise missiles launched from submarines and surface vessels, can potentially overwhelm carrier defenses through saturation attacks. Chinese military doctrine explicitly calls for massed missile strikes using dozens or hundreds of missiles to exhaust American defensive interceptors before follow-on strikes destroy capital ships. A single carrier lost a Chinese missile attack would represent the worst American naval loss since World War II, 6,000 casualties and $25 billion destroyed. The political impact in the United States would be seismic, immediately raising questions about whether Taiwan's fate justifies additional American casualties and losses. But carriers are only the most visible vulnerability. American bases in Japan and South Korea host approximately 80,000 American military personnel. These bases are within range of Chinese ballistic missiles and cruise missiles with accuracy sufficient to strike specific buildings. China has invested heavily in targeting intelligence that allows precise strikes against command centers, fuel depots, ammunition storage, and airfield facilities. If the United States strikes Chinese forces blockading Taiwan, China's rational response is strikes against American bases that host the aircraft conducting those missions. This escalates immediately to attacks on Japanese and South Korean territory, forcing those nations to choose between allowing their territory to be used for American operations or demanding American withdrawal. And here's the calculation that should terrify American strategists. China has approximately 2,000 conventional ballistic missiles with ranges sufficient to strike every American base in Japan, South Korea, and Guam. The United States cannot intercept all of those missiles. Missile defense systems are probabilistic, not absolute. Even 90% interception rate, which exceeds any demonstrated capability, means 200 missiles reach their targets. 200 ballistic missiles with conventional warheads striking American bases means catastrophic damage to runways, fuel storage, command facilities, and personnel. American air operations from those bases would be crippled, potentially for weeks or months. The cost to repair damaged bases and replace destroyed equipment would exceed $100 billion. American casualties would likely reach thousands. And for what? Taiwan would still be blockaded because the Chinese forces implementing the blockade operate from mainland territory that the United States cannot strike without triggering all-out war, including potential nuclear escalation. I assess the probability of direct American military action at approximately 20%, and only in scenarios where the American president faces overwhelming domestic political pressure to act regardless of strategic calculation. Here's what that means. The United States, despite possessing the most powerful military in human history, does not have good options for breaking a Chinese blockade of Taiwan that China is determined to maintain. Every American response option either fails to achieve objectives, imposes costs on American allies greater than costs on China, or escalates to major power war with casualties and destruction that vastly exceed any conceivable benefit from preserving Taiwan's independence. This is not defeatism. This is structural analysis of geography, capabilities, resolve, and cost exchange ratios. Bedi angim so or say sao basis bao editor sao say or sao. Let me walk you through the historical pattern that explains why this scenario is not only possible, but increasingly probable, because the pattern is consistent across 500 years of great power transitions. When a rising power approaches parity with the dominant power, conflict becomes almost inevitable unless one side is willing to accept subordination. The rising power seeks recognition of its new status and adjustment of international arrangements to reflect its increased capabilities. The dominant power seeks to preserve its privileged position and prevent the challenger from achieving parity. Spain was the dominant European power in the 16th century, controlling trade routes, dictating terms to smaller nations, and projecting power globally. Then England rose, built a navy, challenged Spanish control of the seas. The result was war, multiple wars, over decades, until England displaced Spain as the dominant maritime power. France was the dominant continental power in the 18th century under Louis XIV, with the largest army, wealthiest state, and most sophisticated diplomatic service. Then Prussia rose, unified Germany, challenged French dominance. The result was war in 1870, war in 1914, war in 1939, until the European system collapsed entirely and required American intervention to prevent German hegemony. Britain was the dominant global power throughout the 19th century, controlling the seas, dictating international financial arrangements, and maintaining balance of power in Europe. Then Germany rose industrially, built a naval fleet, challenged British dominance. The result was World War I, which destroyed 4 empires and killed 20 million people, followed by World War II, which killed 60 million and ended British dominance permanently.